Okay. Welcome to the Pre-Employment Transition Services for VRS Providers training. We're thrilled to have you all here today. And we thought a good way to know who is in the room presenting to you is to have each of us introduce ourselves. So I am Ann Macklett, and I am the Staff Development Training Specialist here at VRS.
Good afternoon, this is Kim Babine. I'm Director of Community Partnerships with VRS.
Hi everybody, this is Alyssa Klein and I am the VRS Transition and Pre-Employment Transition Specialist. Happy Friday.
Hi, this is Michelle Shimoleski, VR Placement Specialist.
Hello, this is Ann Paulson. I'm the Contract Specialist with the Community Partnerships Unit.
Great, and we wanted to just be able to present the learning objectives of what we hope to accomplish today with your learning. So the first one is know what pre-employment transition services are all about. We're going to go over the definition of a student with disability and help you understand what that is in the context of providing those pre-ed services. We want to take some time to review those PT contract definitions of the 5 required pre-eds. We also want you to learn about the VRS structure for providing these services and to become knowledgeable about what the VRS referral process is for pre-eds. And lastly, we're going to review some information related to pre-eds reporting and invoicing so that when you provide those services, you have some templates and some things to access to provide those reports. So we're going to switch gears here and have Alyssa step in.
Hi again everybody, this is Alyssa Klein and we're going to dig into what are pre-employment transition services. So I'm sure all of you out there is already familiar with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was signed, it's hard to believe, over 5 years ago now, in July of 2014. It amended our Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And there were 2 primary big changes in the world of serving youth with disabilities. And of course, today we're here to talk about pre-employment transition services, or pre-ETS, and also limitations on the use of sub-minimum wage. Also impacts our young people. Of course, we're not focusing on that today, although pre-ETS is a part of that because we want those students to receive pre-ETS as much as possible too. So this is where pre-ETS comes from. It's from our federal law. And really what's exciting about it is that it does require, even though we've all collaborated, it's really a new level of collaboration that we haven't had before. And really truly this new school year with a new model for VRS services and providing pre-ETS and new contracts or amended contracts with all of our providers is another step in that direction of that new collaboration. So it's with schools, it's VRS, counties, and community providers, all of us coming together to serve students with disabilities and, of course, their families as well. All right, so what are pre-employment transition services? So transition services is kind of the broader umbrella of thinking about young people with disabilities moving from school to eventually, ideally, competitive integrated employment. Pre-ETS is a component of that bigger, broader picture because transition starts in high school and continues possibly into post-secondary, and again, once somebody's in competitive integrated employment into that career. But pre-ETS is a component because it's while that individual is still in an education program. Pre-ETS are also meant to be an early start to career exploration. That's what Congress had in mind. And what's interesting is that they not only call out these pre-ETS services for those who are eligible, but also for those who are potentially eligible. So potentially eligible students who receive pre-ETS, and we're going to talk more about that definition of potentially eligible, but those students could possibly may not need our regular intensive VR services because they've received these pre-ETS and they're good to go. Others may be more well-informed and ready for VR as a result of receiving pre-ETS. So that's a part of why we provide them. And then for eligible students, it's really just making sure that we're looking at these components of transition and really making sure that students have access and receive really important services that really gets them on the road towards competitive integrated employment while they're in school. Okay, so we talked about eligible and potentially eligible, and so let's talk through, what that means. Of course, eligible students are those who the VRS program traditionally serves. So these are individuals who have applied for and have been determined eligible and also are not on our wait list, so that we're able to serve them because they have 3 or more functional limitations. Eligible students receive pre-ETS in working with the VRS counselors, and they include the needed pre-ETS as part of that employment plan that the VRS counselors create with that student. Potentially eligible students include any student that has, it can include, I should say, any student with a documented disability who is in an education program and is in the age range of grade 9 through age 21. And now we have VRS pre-ETS representatives that coordinated needed pre-ETS for this population. And here's just a picture of the intent of the journey, I think from Congress and from the Rehabilitation Services Administration. The idea is that students with disabilities would start out by receiving pre-ETS, oftentimes as potentially eligible students. Of course, it would be eligible as well. And then moving on to other VR services that they might need, and then on to competitive integrated employment. They kind of saw it as a linear journey. And I just want to call out that for those that are eligible, they can receive other VR services while they're receiving pre-ETS. So it really, truly isn't always so linear. So as a good example, a student in high school who's eligible for VR services might be receiving or, want to do a work experience. But that student might need a job coach to help them be successful in that work experience. Job coaching, unfortunately, is not considered a pre-ETS service. It's an other VR service. So they might be receiving those two together. Or sometimes it might just be a pre-ETS service and other times just a VR service. Anyway, just to be clear that students who are in high school who are eligible might be receiving both in different ways. All right, let's be very clear when we're talking about pre-ETS. There are 5 required services that are outlined in WIOA and our regulations, and those 5 activities are listed here. The first is job exploration counseling. Then we have work-based learning experiences, post-secondary education counseling, workplace readiness training, and instruction in self-advocacy. We're going to get into all the definitions in a little while. But before we start digging into definitions, we just want to make a few other clarifying points with pre-ETS. First of all, that pre-ETS are meant to be provided in collaboration with secondary schools because we know that schools provide a lot of these services already, and we don't want to be duplicating services. We really want to be looking at utilizing the VRS resources to fill in gaps, basically. Secondly, that they must be made available statewide. It's not to say that we would be serving every student. VRS couldn't. I mean, I think we would love to, but we don't have enough funds to be able to, but we at least have to have them available. And again, it's regardless whether a student has applied for VRS services or the regular VR program, and that's where those potentially eligible students come into play. Any student with a disability who's in school is considered to be potentially eligible. And that term required sometimes trips people up. Again, we're only required to have them available to those that actually need them. So we're not required, I've already said this, but required to provide them to every student with a disability. And they're only provided based on the need that a student has for those services. So we're not just providing them randomly. We want to know that the student actually needs that service. And it's not saying that if a student is receiving pre-ETS that they must have all 5 of those activities provided, or that one type of pre-ETS precede another type, or that they have a certain prescribed number of pre-ETS. There's no rules or regulations around those types of things. And I'm going to pass it over to Ann Macklett, who's going to talk about another important piece about pre-ETS.
Yes, it's important to think about pre-ETS in the standpoint of that pre-ETS are more about exploration and not assessment. So one way we thought we'd demonstrate this is to get you to think about some of the synonyms between exploration and assessment and doing that comparison. So synonyms commonly used for exploration are things like search, so where somebody's trying to figure out where they want to go, inquiry, asking a lot of questions along the way, and journey and adventure, where somebody's really trying to find out more about themselves and the world they live in and the environment that they want to be in. And on the flip side, assessment, you can have synonyms like evaluation or recommendation. We know those recommendations are kind of that end product of that assessment. Then you have things like estimation and appraisal, but you get this picture of somebody coming in to conduct an evaluation against a standard or an expectation. And really the whole goal of that expert is to provide those recommendations on what should be done and what should be done with the scenario or the situation. But when we look at pre-employment transition services exploration experiences, they are meant to be more self-discovery based, more student-driven, and we say person-centered in nature. It's when the individual is given the opportunity to understand their own interests and speak to what they like and dislike and what they've learned from those experiences. With those experiences, a lot of time we like the students to have this chance to self-reflect and gain some insight over time to determine what they want to do next and what they have learned along the way. So those self-driven exploratory learning experiences we call pre-ETS. When we think of assessment, there's often a traditional assessment, an evaluator or a VRS staff doing an assessment, and the hope is always to better understand that individual's interest and their skills and abilities, so that and becomes important. In typical assessments, the staff or the assessor is really trying to observe someone, write down ratings and recommendations, determine limitations, maybe even look at those needs, for the purpose of driving that end report, that comprehensive report. So as you can see those situations lay out, this next slide just talks more specifically about those things we just discussed, which is basically pre-ETS are more meant to be driven by the student, what is important to them to explore and what they like and don't like. They're meant to be more informal. And lastly, the only report we get should come from either the student or the employer report when we think about these exploratory experiences. Whereas assessment services, on the other hand, are more third-party driven, or maybe a VRS staff is going to be driving it, doing those observations and the ratings. And the services are more formal, trying to just understand more about that person, and the report really comes from those assessors. So that hopefully will help you kind of think about the difference what pre-ETS provides.
And I'll just say that's not to say assessment can be a VR service, so we can still provide that, but we just can't count it as a pre-ETS service. And RSA has been very clear with us. We got to be very careful when it comes to pre-ETS that it is more that informal, exploratory experience. And again, it's important that we are partnering with schools so a student can receive pre-ETS through VRS or their educational program. And a part of what the responsibility of VRS staff is to understand what schools are already providing related to pre-ETS, again, so we're not duplicating. And this is a part of WIOA. I won't read it verbatim here, but it basically says that, we're not here to replace what schools are obligated to do in special education or IDEA, which is the federal legislation for special ed. Again, we're filling in the gaps where they're not able to provide and they're not mandated necessarily to provide something. All right. So shifting gears, it's really important to understand the definition of a student with a disability in terms of pre-employment transition services. And there are three parts to the definition of student with a disability, and that's what we're going to review in this section of the presentation. So the first part is disability, the second part is age, and the third part is educational program. So number one, disability. A student may receive pre-ETS if they either are in special ed or have an IEP, or they have a 504 plan from the school, or they may not have either of those more formalized plans, but they have a documented disability that's documented through another medical or mental health provider. So it's pretty broad. It's just having some sort of documentation of having a disability. So that's that piece. The second part is age. And this visual helps you to wrap your head around when we talk about a student with a disability for pre-ETS. We're talking about grade 9 through age 21. And the reason why that is the age range is that WIOA says we need to mirror what our Minnesota definition is in terms of special education. So special ed in Minnesota, in our state law, must provide transition services on the IEP from starting no later than grade 9 through the age of 21, as long as the student is still in school. And we compare that because youth, and this is also a term in WIOA that many of you might be familiar with if you're familiar with 511 or those that might be seeking sub-minimum wage, they call out youth in that piece of it. And a youth is any individual who is under the age of 25. So a youth can be a student, but a student may not necessarily be a youth. No, I said that wrong. See, I confused you all and I'm confusing myself. Never mind. Hopefully it's Friday.
Keeping it loose.
Yeah, oh my goodness. But you know what I mean. So anyway, we're focusing on grade 9 through age 21, and those are the age range for students with disabilities in terms of pre-ETS. Okay, so again, they must be in an educational program. And so we typically think of students who are in secondary education programs, like in the high school, or maybe in an 18 to 21 transition program. But it can also include other non-traditional sort of programs like ALCs, Alternative Learning Centers. It could be a student who is homeschooled. It also includes post-secondary education programs or other recognized educational programs, like there are programs in the juvenile justice system or, in treatment programs, etc. The key is that they're in an education program if it provides a recognized credential of education. So if you are in high school, you are working towards a high school diploma, and that's a recognized credential of education. If you are in adult basic education and you're working on your GED, then that's the credential you're working toward. Of course, when you're in post-secondary education, there are different credentials that you may be working toward as well. So that's the key. And it's also important to know that when students graduate from high school, but they've enrolled in a post-secondary education program for the fall, they're still considered a student for pre-ETS purposes during that break. And other breaks throughout the year. So as long as they're always enrolled in an education program until they turn age 22, they could still be receiving pre-employment transition services. So let's summarize for you. All three of these must be checked in order for somebody to be eligible for pre-employment transition services. They must have a documented disability. They must be within the age range of grade 9 through age 21, and they must be in an educational program. I'm going to pass it over to Ann that's going to walk you through a little quiz to make this a little more exciting for you.
That's right. We thought we'd mix it up a bit for you. So we are going to test your knowledge on the definition of pre-ed students. So what you can do is either just visually look at this and make a mental note of what your answer is, or feel free to get out a piece of paper and put down yes or no for this A through E, the different questions. So what we want you to do is just note, are these students that are identified a pre-ed student with a disability? So number one, you can start with Jeremy, and we're going to give you about a minute to do this, and we'll mute ourselves a little bit so you can have that time. All right, hopefully that gave everybody enough time to get through the A through E. So the first one, Jeremy is 17 years old and is a junior at XYZ High School. Is he a student, a pre-ed student? The answer is yes, he obviously is, because he is still in high school. So that is a yes. B, True is 18 years old, graduated from high school in June, and is enrolled to attend ABC Community College in August. The answer on that one as well is yes, as long as the individual is enrolled in an educational program, and they are considered a student even on breaks and in between terms. C, Gilbert is 22 years old and attends ABC Community College. The answer on that one is no. Once you turn 22, that individual can no longer be considered a student for pre-ed purposes. D is Daniela, is 19 years old and attends adult basic education GED classes. The answer here is yes. Actually, Daniela is working on her GED, which is a recognized credential of education. And then lastly, E, Ayan is 20 years old and attends Metro CRP for office skills training. So this was a tricky one. Wanted to throw one in just to see if you're awake on a Friday. So the answer here is it would depend. If the CRP does not have students take an exam for a recognized credential at the end of the program, then it does not count. If they do, then it does. So hopefully you got that one. Extra bonus points.
Hi everybody, it's Kim again, and we are going to go through the definitions and contract titles for the 5 required pre-employment transition services. So first wanted to draw your attention to this desk aid that we made for you. So we have a list of the service titles that you can put on your contracts and the definitions for them. And this is on our website as well, but this can be your guide as you're determining what services you want to provide and helping with expectations between you and your organization and the people who work for you, as well as the VR staff. So this can be a reference guide for you. The first one that we'll talk about is pre-ETS job exploration counseling. Now, pre-ETS job exploration counseling is intended to foster motivation, consideration of opportunities, and informed decision making. And under this service type, there's one service title, which is Job Exploration Counseling Services. And you can see the definition there. I won't read it for you. The next one is pre-ETS Post-Secondary Education Counseling. And this also has just one title, and that's to assist students with enrolling or remaining enrolled in post-secondary education or training by helping them to do a variety of things that you can see there. So those are pretty straightforward. The next service type is PREET's Workplace Readiness Training. Now, work readiness skills are a set of skills and behaviors that are necessary for most jobs. And workplace readiness training may be offered on an individual basis or in a generalized manner in a classroom or other such group setting to provide programming to assist students with disabilities to develop social skills and independent living skills necessary to prepare for eventual employment. And Alyssa, you were is going to talk a little bit about readiness.
Yeah, just a word on that, because that can throw people off sometimes, because we want to assume that everybody is ready to work. If they want to work, they're ready. But in the context of pre-employment transition services, we're looking at people, again, this is meant to be an early start, so young people. And, of course, there's always room for building skills in certain areas. So it's not to say we don't want to work on teamwork or team building skills or whatever it might be related to workplace readiness, but we don't want it to mean, oh, you're not ready for work yet, especially in the context of employment first, which is all about, let's let employment be the first option for everybody. So we just wanted to remind everyone of that.
Yeah. Excellent. So there are 4 titles, different services under workplace readiness training that we wanted to highlight. The first is actually a slight change from lists that we sent out initially about benefits information services. Before, we had called it benefits planning and analysis, and we just wanted to distinguish from other services that we provide for general VR services, so that's why there's just a name change. And it's to assist the student to understand how their benefits work in order to help them with their career planning. And the way you can distinguish this from other services for general VR participants is that it's more of a high-level overview and it's general in nature. We also have independent living services or training, public transportation training, and job-seeking skills training. And this slide goes into more depth on that with the definition. That was a lot of paper. Okay. PREET's instruction in self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is the ability to effectively communicate, convey, negotiate, or assert his or her own interests and or desires, and to learn about self-determination, which is taking the responsibility for communicating one's needs and desires in a straightforward manner to others. And there's one title underneath Instruction in Self-Advocacy, which is simply Instruction in Self-Advocacy Services. All right. Then we have some mentoring definitions that is important to understand that fall under self-advocacy. There's different types of mentoring that can be, that fall under this umbrella. That is peer mentoring, which is about a person close in age to his or her mentee, acting as a sounding board for ideas and plans, providing guidance in an informal manner. There's disability mentoring, which is where a person with a disability mentors another person, usually with a similar disability. Group mentoring, a mentor may work with a group of mentees, or e-mentoring, where an adult mentors a young person through email or the internet. All right, then we have PREET's work-based learning, which is an educational approach or instructional methodology that uses the workplace or real work to provide students with the knowledge and skills that will help them connect school experiences to real-life work activities and future career opportunities. And they may include in-school opportunities, after-school opportunities, and experience can be outside the traditional school setting. This experience is outside the traditional school setting in an integrated environment to the maximum extent possible. And it's essential that the direct employer or community involvement be a component. And you can see here a list of different types of work-based learning generally. some of which are services that you can put on your contract that VRS can purchase from your organization. So the ones that you can put on your contract there are 7 of them under this umbrella. There's a career mentorship experience, informational interview, job shadow, service learning, workplace tour or field trip, and then there are work experiences, and Alyssa's going to walk you through that.
Okay, so this is where we really dig in because it's a little more complicated when we're talking about work experiences. But really, they're one of the most important. They're all important services, but this is, I think, where we see a lot of traction or a lot of interest is just getting out there and trying out work. So number 6 is work experience services, which is about facilitating a work experience intended for the student to understand the nature of work and build soft skills. And as we emphasized earlier, we only want the student or the business to be giving feedback on how the experience went. I do want to emphasize, too, that doesn't mean that you or your agency is not actually sending in a report, because we still need, a report to come with an invoice. But it's just saying on that report, and we're going to show you an example of one, you're just reporting what the student said about that experience and what the employer said about that experience. And again, I mentioned this one earlier. The service does not encompass job coaching because RSA said that job coaching cannot be a pre-ET service. However, if a student needed job coaching and they're eligible, they must be an eligible student, then it could be authorized separately by the VR counselor. Unfortunately, those potentially eligible students can only receive those 5 pre-ETs. And because job coaching isn't considered pre-ETs, VR is not able to fund job coaching for those students. Okay, and so when VRS is authorizing work experience services, it means that your agency can provide any or all of these items within that service category. So let's walk through that a little bit. So the first item is the first meeting, which I just want to, we have another slide on this a little bit later, but another thing that RSA says is that we can't fund intakes with pre-ETs. But we all understand, excuse me, there needs to be that first meeting with the student, with the provider, and with the VRS staff person to all meet to talk about what's going to happen. You're going to probably have some paperwork or whatnot on your end that needs to be done. So that can still happen. We're just calling that the first meeting. And it also is a time for the students that are getting the work experience services, and we're going to talk more about this one, to complete a work experience placement plan. The second item that can be a part of this service is, it says set up the work experience. It also can be about developing the work experience or helping the student search for that experience. But it's all the work that goes into place in helping that student find a work experience. And then once the student has a work experience set up, it's orienting that student to the work experience. So who's their supervisor? How am I going to get there? Do I have my uniform? All those things that are important for the student to know. And then once they've started, it's the following up and checking in with the student and employer. And the frequency is based on the need of that student, and it's discussed between you or your agency, the VRS staff person, and the student based on their needs. All right. Now there are 2 reasons that VRS would refer a student for work experience services. The first reason would be for a student to gain an experience where the employer pays the wages. In other words, think of it just like our typical job placement process. It really is job placement, but it's for a work experience. Because we say it's job placement because they're getting a job in the community, the employer is going to pay their wages. So for this service, VRS staff can authorize up to 20 hours for all the items on slide 48. That's these 4 things that I mentioned. So 20 hours for any or all of these items. The second reason that VRS staff may refer a student is to gain a work experience where you or your agency, I should say, as the provider is paying their wages. So it could be where you're assisting the student with finding that site where they're going to do a work experience, or you might have a set site. But it's always going to be, in this case, number 2 here, a short-term experience where you as a provider are paying the wage. So what we've changed a bit with that is that we initially said the maximum that VRS could authorize would be 5 hours, and that still is the case. Again, this is for all items on slide 48. It still is the case when your organization has a set site. So you already have a relationship developed. You got an opening for that site, and the student's going to start there and work there for a work experience. However, what we've heard loud and clear from all of our partners is that if you are helping a student to develop a new site, they're going to still do a short-term work experience, but you have to develop a new site. That can take just as long as it takes to help them with number 1, which is finding a regular placement in the community. So for those cases, we can authorize up to 20 hours for all items on slide 48 if you're helping the student to develop a site. Now, another thing that we've communicated with our staff is that in terms of a short-term experience, a best practice would be that the length of that experience is about 120 hours. Now, it's a best practice. It's not saying it has to be 120 hours, but it's a good length of time. It's used a lot. That amount is often used with the U.S. Department of Labor when they're looking at work experiences. I know State Services for the Blind has a cap on their work experiences to be 120 hours. But we're saying it's a best practice. Certainly it could be a shorter experience, or it could go longer. It's based on the needs of the student, what everyone decides. And then the last thing to take note of is we've mentioned the 20 hours for authorizing and 5 hours. Certainly there could be more hours authorized, but it just needs to go through the RAM to approve it, or the local manager, because we really want to try as much as possible to keep the cost of services in check, and to keep within those hours, those 5 and 20 hours, as much as possible. All right, so number 7 on the list of services is work experience wages. So this comes into play with the work experience services when your agency is going to be paying the wages of the student for a short-term work experience. So we also have to authorize for those wages. So that would mean that it's looking at the hourly rate of pay, that the actual wage that student is going to make, plus 25% to cover your agency's administrative costs. So if it's $9.86 an hour, which I believe I said the right amount for minimum wage right now, it's plus 25%, which I can't remember the exact amount, but I think it comes to $12.33 an hour if it was minimum wage. I don't know why I remembered that, but anyway, hopefully that makes sense. We have another example in here that walks you through it too. A few other notes in terms of paid work-based learning. If students are paid, they must be paid at competitive wages to the same extent competitive wages are paid to students without disabilities and similar experiences. And training stipends can be permissible to the same extent they are provided to students without disabilities. To be honest, that's not something that we're probably seeing too often. Stipends aren't too often. And in terms of unpaid work experiences, currently we don't have that as an option on contracts because we figure internal staff can help. Say if a student's looking for a volunteer experience, if they need some extra assistance, we can utilize internal placement specialists to help with that as needed. So that's why we don't have that on contracts at this time. Plus, we want to promote paid work as much as possible. There are a few, we have a whole list of work-based learning activities, and there are some that aren't reflected in service titles, and I just wanted to call those out real quickly. So on this slide, on slide 54, there's a few that are in red that we have definitions for and an explanation why they're not in your contracts. Why? It's because typically these are things that are supported by or funded by schools or other entities, or it could be an unpaid work experience, which I just explained is something we're going internal for at this time. So we have definitions for all of those other items in case you're curious, and I'm not going to read through them, but you can see what they are in case you are curious. So again, schools oftentimes support a lot of these things. All right, so now we'll go into the VRS structure now for providing pre-ETS, which has recently changed. So this fall, as we're going into the high schools, we're going in with counselors and our new pre-ETS representatives, and we're talking to schools about how we have two types now of VRS services for students who are in high school. The type on the right are for students, goes over students eligible for VR, and again, those are our traditional services, whereas the column on the left reviews the types of services we have available for potentially eligible students. And let's go through that table real quickly. So first of all, we look at the description of services. So for potentially eligible students, we're talking about services that are basic exploratory services that are limited to those 5 required pre-ETS activities, and we want to often see these provided in groups because then we can serve more students that way. And then students eligible, those are more comprehensive services. It's the pre-ETS services plus our regular VR intensive services, and those are typically only provided one-on-one. The target population that we have for potentially eligible students are those that are younger in age and those that have less significantly impacting disabilities. And what we mean by that is that those that would typically go on our wait list and might not be served by our regular VR program, because these really are services, are meant to be services for a broader population that we're not able to serve. So that's the beauty of this, because we do see students fall through the cracks. So let's see them served by these potentially eligible services. And of course, for eligible, it's those we're looking at, we say older students, we're saying a referral for our regular VR program is good at 2 years, typically, before they graduate. And again, those are students that have more significantly impacting disabilities. How to qualify, we've talked about that for potentially eligible students. It's simply verifying that they have a disability, they're in an education program, and they're in that age range. It does also include those who go on the wait list, so if they apply and they go on the wait list, they can still receive those potentially eligible services. And then you probably all know how you qualify for the regular VR program, so I won't say more than that right now. And the length of service, we really need to be clear with the students that we serve who are potentially eligible. The minute they turn 22 or the minute they're no longer in an education program, unfortunately, there's a hard stop. There needs to be a hard stop to those services. So, we're really going to be watching those milestones so that there's no surprises for those students. But as soon as they're done with school, turn age 22, those services end. Of course, for students who are eligible, we can provide services all the way until they're into that long-term job, that career, in competitive integrated employment, and they're successful in that pursuit. And then just looking at the roles of pre-ETS representatives and VR counselors, because these are the two entities you'll be receiving referrals from. They will both be managing a caseload. This is how their roles are the same. They are both going to be doing outreach to the schools, although they'll often be doing that together. They both provide pre-ETS to students with disabilities. They both will be coordinating, referring, and authorizing for the pre-ETS services. and they're both an important part of the VR team. And this is how their roles are different. So just like with the definition, it makes sense that the pre-ETS representative is only providing or ensuring that there's the provision of those 5 pre-ETS, whereas the VR counselor is looking at the pre-ETS and VR services. The pre-ETS rep is only serving potentially eligible students. So for instance, if a student then chooses to apply for regular VR services, they'll be handed off to the counselor if they're eligible for those services. Pre-ETS reps, we have 1 for every team in the state, which we recognize probably it'd be nice if we could have more, but we're excited to start here with having 1 on every team. So they're doing more broad outreach in the geographic area that team covers. So we have 23 teams in our state, and they're going to be doing broad outreach within all those teams. Whereas the VR counselor, we have a counselor assigned to every school, and so each counselor that's serving schools may have 1 to sometimes up to 14, 15 schools, but it's a smaller number of schools than the outreach that the pre-ETS reps will be covering. Pre-ETS rep looking at lighter touch services, VR counselor intensive, and then the representative is looking at group and one-on-one services where the counselor is only providing one-on-one. So this fall, the reps and the counselors are going out into schools together. They're doing it as we speak, and talking with schools about these 2 levels of services. They're talking about how there's a counselor and a representative assigned to each school. There's a link here for all of you. You can click on it and it goes to our DEED website, and you will see the directories that we have for schools, and we have a directory of counselors assigned to schools and then a directory of pre-ETS reps. And so we realize that these representatives can't be going out to every single school in the state, so they're working together to prioritize where they see the most needs for pre-ETS and starting with schools where there are more needs and working their way into as many schools as they can. And again, they'll be assessing what pre-ETS the schools are already providing and then talking about how to refer students. So recruiting students, schools, families, community partners can all refer students to either VR or pre-ETS for potentially eligible students. Of course, for VR services, it starts with an application, as it always has. For pre-ETS for potentially eligible students, we have particular paperwork that needs to be completed, and the first page of that is called the Request for Pre-Employment Transition Services. And this slide just reviews the processes for moving forward and providing services. So it kind of reviews what I have already reviewed. It's just kind of a recap. All right, now we'll get into the referral process. So from VRS coming to all of you as our providers, this is what you can expect. So if a VR counselor wants to refer a student who is eligible for VR, they will complete our universal referral form, which we always have been completing, so nothing has been changed there. It's the same referral process when a student is eligible. And I have the link to the referral form here, but I'm not going to pull it up because I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with that. Potentially eligible students, however, we have a different referral form, and I will pull that up really quick. And it looks like this, and it says Pre-Employment Transition Services Referral for Potentially Eligible Students. So we're really clear on who we're referring to you when you get this form. And it's pretty self-explanatory, has information about the student and the reason for the referral. There's another page on here that I'm going to share with you in a little bit, but it's potentially 3 pages long, and I'll come back to it in a little bit. Okay, but why did we do 2 forms? The eligible students may receive regular VR services along with pre-ETS, so that's one reason. Because again, the potentially eligible students can only receive the 5 pre-ETS, or one of the 5, depending on what we're referring them for. Also, information collected from each of these populations is very different. And this next slide goes through, just so you're aware, we are only collecting what we are mandated to collect in terms of what RSA asks us to collect for each student who is potentially eligible. So this is the list of data elements, and you'll see, just some basic information, their name and contact, date of birth, race, and ethnicity. And then I guess a big one is that bullet second from the bottom where it says verification that a student has a disability, but we're not getting any detail on what the disability is or how it's impacting that student. So we won't be sending records, medical records or school records over to you along with the referral for the potentially eligible students because we don't have that information. Again, this is supposed to be a service that's more general in nature, and that's a big reason why. So just FYI on that. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the process for work experience referrals, where it's really essentially the job placement process, because we want it to mirror in many ways how job placement works for our adult population when we have a PBA. These aren't PBAs, but we want to mirror the process in many ways.
So there'll be, when you're working with pre-ed students or with VR eligible students, we'll be continuing to use the placement team approach to ensure that all parties stay engaged and know their roles throughout job search and the follow-up process. The placement team will continue to include the VR counselor or the new VR placement rep, the community partner, and the student. The school and school staff and families may be added to the placement team. However, the referral process and the information you will receive will be different for students that are eligible and for students that are potentially eligible working with the pre-ed representative. VR counselors will continue to utilize the existing invitation to placement and will be submitting the typical paperwork that includes an assessment of the VR needs, sample application, and a resume if available. You will note that on the top of the invitation to placement, boxes have been added to determine the type of placement that is being requested. So when you are receiving a referral from a pre-ed rep, they'll be submitting the invitation to placement along with pages 1 through 3 of the pre-ed referral form. A sample application and a resume will also be submitted if available.
I just want to clarify, this is Alyssa. So for potentially eligible students, what we've done is in the referral form, there's 3 pages for the pre-ed referral for potentially eligible students. On page 3, you will receive page 3, which has a lot of the same information that's in the invitation to placement. So you don't get the invitation to placement, but you'll get page 3 for students who are potentially eligible. So students who are eligible, you get the invitation to placement along with the regular VRS referral. For students who are potentially eligible, you'll get the full 3 pages of the pre-ed referral form with page 3 saying complete this section for work experience services only, and it has that invitation to placement information.
Thank you, Alyssa. It's Friday afternoon, so I apologize. Prior to receiving a referral for work experience students to help them with finding employment, the VR counselor, a pre-ed rep, or someone that we contract with will be working with the student to discuss the placement team approach, the roles of the job seeker, the placement professional, the VRS counselor, and the pre-ed rep, and other possible team members. We'll be using the informed choice with the student. They'll be discussing the interests and the goals of the individual, their employment-related skills and abilities, perhaps discussing some labor market information, if they have a criminal background, and how that employment may be potentially impacted by that background. We also can discuss credit reports and credit history as they relate to the job goal, but most likely with students, that won't be a factor. We'll continue to discuss transportation, housing, any care arrangements. Some students may have child care responsibilities, medical insurance, cultural or religious considerations, talking a little bit about disability disclosure, what support systems are in place. Do they have school staff to help support them on the jobs? Can their families be a resource to them, or the pre-ETS representative? We'll be continuing to verify the employment authorization documents prior to inviting a provider to the placement team. We'll be encouraging the students to keep those in a safe place so they have those available when a job offer is made. So once the first meeting has been held, all team members will continue the placement team approach by discussing disability disclosure, supported employment, independent living, and benefit services throughout the entire placement process. Remember, VR is unable to fund job coaching services to students that are potentially eligible. The team will continue ongoing conversations about any necessary reasonable accommodations, natural supports, and a supportive work culture for the student. So you'll continue to hold a first meeting where we'll be signing the placement plan. The agency staff person who is providing placement services is considered the placement professional. The placement professional will be leading the conversation and discussions with the job seeker, the VRS counselor, the pre-ETS rep, through development of the placement plan. And Alyssa, do you want to pull up the placement plan?
Sure.
So you may all know that the plan is a template for identifying the responsibilities of each of the core team members, the job seeker, the placement professional, the VR counselor, and the pre-ETS representative. These responsibilities should be identified and agreed upon by the team during the placement plan meeting. Not all items will be applicable to each job seeker. Select only the items that apply. And it's very important to discuss the expectations of each party involved in the placement process. Each core member will sign the placement plan. Some of the providers have incorporated the VR placement plan into their own, and that's fine as long as the roles and responsibilities for each party are clearly defined. So all core members will sign the placement plan and will be receiving a signed copy. So let's just take a look at some of the services that can be provided to both students and potentially eligible students throughout the placement process. Identifying and developing job opportunities. This may include researching the labor market, contacting employers, showing the job seeker resources for job search, and researching job openings on Minnesota Works and other job boards. assisting the student with creating and updating a resume. This is often an ongoing process, tailoring the resume to fit the job they are currently applying for. Helping the student complete employment applications, both paper and online. Occasionally, these can be very challenging. The job seeker may also need assistance with the various pre-employment tests that employers often use, such as personality and aptitude tests. Student may need some assistance with preparing for job interviews. May be helpful to review and practice sample interview questions, arrange for mock interviews when possible, and informational interviews when needed. Helping the student to complete cover letters, thank you letters, and job search emails. The provider may also discuss the importance of these letters with the student and help them with creating templates for them. Making sure that the job is a good match. Be sure to assess the environment and determine any needed accommodations. Working with the employer to identify and eliminate barriers. This may include suggesting modifications and any support needs the student may have while addressing any structural and attitudinal barriers.
All right, this is Kim again, and we're going to talk a little bit about authorization and rates. So we've talked about the referral. As always, this isn't changing. An authorization for payment must be completed by VRS prior to providing services. And we did develop a consistent, standardized pre-ETS rates for services statewide. So if you're looking to provide these services on your contract, we'll talk a little bit about those rates in a few minutes, but those are what we've determined for all contractors. And as always, the pre-ETS services that your agency is willing to provide and the rates will be listed on your contract. We'll talk a little bit about group services. So this is a new era for DEED VRS in that we are encouraging providers to provide pre-ETS services in groups where it's appropriate. And so this is the first time that we've done this in quite some time, and so we've set up a structure and we will be monitoring it and evaluating it as it rolls out, and we'll be interested in your feedback in the coming months, and we'll just be checking in with you to see how it's working. So we're going forward this way, and we'll be sure to check back in. So the way this has to work for authorizing and getting payment for group services is all based on the fact that any dollars, the Rehab Services Administration is really strict about this, that any dollars that we spend have to be tied to the individual. And so we need to be authorizing and invoicing based on the individual. So when there's a group service, VRS will pay based on the number of students who were referred by VRS and who attended the group service. Students referred must be enrolled with VRS as either an eligible or potentially eligible student, and VRS cannot pay for those that were referred but didn't attend. And so we need to the VRS staff we're not able to say to pay your organization a set amount flat fee for a class. We have to individually authorize for those students to then be able to attend the class. That's how you're going to get payment for these group services. And so VRS staff will be authorizing individually, and just so you understand how it works, they are going to be authorizing for the highest amount per student per hour that it could be, and then you'll get paid based on the number of students who attend, and so that cost per student per hour will most likely be less. And so just keep in mind that the amount that's on the authorization is not necessarily the amount that you'll be paid. So on completion of that class, VRS will adjust the billing based on the number of students. who were referred by VRS and who attended that group service. Again, it's really important that there might be a situation in which maybe you provide a class or group service and there are a number of VRS enrolled individuals who attend that. And maybe you're doing it at a school and the school says, oh, hey, can I send a couple more people to that class that you're conducting? And that would be up to you if you want to let them come in, but we won't be able to pay rates based on those students who are not VRS enrolled. So to that end, your agency must keep a class list which documents which students attended. This is for monitoring purposes. And in that case that I just mentioned where your agency allowed additional students to attend, make sure you identify on the class list which students were referred by VRS and which students were not referred by VRS. At this time, we are not asking you to send that information to us. We want you to keep it, and you need to keep it so that that record exists. Okay, so the rates that we developed, again, they're consistent and standardized statewide, and they'll be listed on your contract. We developed a rate structure, and this is available on our website as well. So you can look and see that we have it organized by individual rates. So most of the PREET's individual services are $75 an hour. It's based on an hourly service. The work experience wages are the wages the individual is earning plus 25% for administrative purposes per hour. Then we set up a group rate. So you'll be able to see that we have listed out the number of students who are in the group and then the cost per student per hour. And that generally goes down as more students are in the class, but the payment to you, the total payment to you goes up as there are more students in the class. So it's a win-win for both sides there. And then we also, perfect. So we also know that some of you provide services that are, quite a distance from your organization's home base, and we want to be able to allow you to do that and have rates that allow for you to do that. We can't charge mileage. That's a rule that we have, and so we roll that into the rates themselves. And so you'll see this travel differential grid allows for higher rates the further you are from your site. It's important to note that intake is not allowed with PREETs. That's another RSA decision. So it can't be paid out of PREETs funds, but VRS can authorize for the time spent at the first meeting at the hourly rate of services. So typical intake activities like signing paperwork, etc., can take place at this meeting. You'll also know that VRS is not able to pay a no-show fee or a cancellation fee. It's important just with general VR clients that your agency will want to confirm appointments and classroom visits ahead of time to reduce those no-shows. And always keep in touch if a student doesn't show for an appointment. We want to keep in touch with that student.
So we have some examples on here, and of course, this gets to be a long presentation, and so, again, it's Friday afternoon, late in the day, so I am not going to read through them. I think they are helpful, and you're going to have our contact information at the end of these slides. So I say to you, I think it's a great idea to read through them. You can contact me if you have questions about some of these examples that we have, but I think it helps you wrap your head around the work experience services, because I think that's the more complicated piece of this, and it kind of shows you how, for a student looking either for a community experience where the employer is paying the wage, or an example when it's a short-term work experience where your organization's paying the wages, how that really looks in terms of authorizing. So I would say that's a good idea to read through, and we're just not going to read it to you, and we're going to help you get to the weekend that much faster.
All right, so this is Kim. Again, we're going to talk through the reporting and invoicing. So the reporting and invoicing process looks the same for PREETs as it does for any other service that you provide to VRS participants. And it mostly looks the same for both eligible and potentially eligible students. However, keep in mind that for potentially eligible students, or under PREETs, we want to make sure that there's no third-party assessment, and you're the third party. We want to encourage student reflection and employer feedback on those. And just as any other service, the invoice and accompanying report should be emailed to the email address printed on the specific authorization. The email address will be for the appropriate VRS office.
Am I behind?
You are ahead.
Oh,
sorry. All right. So with the invoicing report requirements, these are the same as you see for any other VR service. So, you know, description of the services, the actual dates they were provided, and for hourly service, the number of hours provided on each date. And we do have a sample report that is on our website that you can use just to make sure you have all the right requirements. And there is a special report for work-based learning to VRS, and that just makes sure that we're capturing the right information we need to be able, you know, for the Rehab Services Administration to make sure we're capturing all the correct information.
If I'll just say real quickly, where it says documentation that emails and phone calls don't count, I did get a number of questions about that, and I do want to clarify. If you are helping a student with looking for a work experience in the community and you need to make phone calls as a part of that experience, that would count. That's a part of setting it up. It's just when you're doing a phone call to set up a meeting with the student, and some of that's considered administrative types of costs and activities. So hopefully that makes sense. Like the time you're doing your case notes or something, that would not count. But, you know, if it's related to that direct service with that student, then it's okay.
And if you have questions about that and where that line is, Ann Paulson is the one to contact. And again, her contact information will be at the end, and she can help walk you through that.
Yeah.
All right, so as you report during the PREET's job placement process, it looks a little different than our regular placement and retention PBA for general services. So you can see there what we require for the PBA for the placement and retention. So there's the placement plan and the summary report, communication updates, and the closure summary. For the PREET's job placement, or again, for the PREET's job placement, you'll have the placement plan. You'll have the typical invoicing report that you'll send. This is actually, instead of slide 85 or 86, it is on slide 92.
Or 91.
No, we're on
this one
91.
Is the sample report. So I flipped back. There's a sample report there on slide 91. So I apologize. We forgot to update that.
Perfect. But for all the other pieces, you'll just include the typical invoicing report that we have listed there. So that's how you will invoice. With the invoicing requirements, again, this is very similar, the same, what you do for general VR services. But the thing that we want to be sure to highlight is, in addition to the requirements that are listed there, when it's a group service, we want you'll need to include the number of students that were referred by VRS or VRS folks that were in attendance at the meeting. So that will actually be how you determine what you're invoicing us for, what rate you're determining, or what rate you're invoicing us for, and that will be our way when we reconcile the invoice to make sure everything's matching up. So if it's a group service, include that number. The other pieces of the invoicing requirements, again, are the standard ones. No surprises here. And there's also a sample invoice that you can use. You don't have to use, but it just makes sure to include all those requirements.
So now we're at the point where we're done with our content. There was a lot, and we understand that. We do hope to have other webinars and ways of getting information out to all of you in the future, because we know this is a lot. We know we're all going to be learning a lot together over this next year. So as time goes along, we'll send out more information. But we want to know what your questions are now. You can type them in the Q&A or the chat box.
Correct.
Do we have any so far, Anne?
We do not have any
No,
yet.
none yet. We'll wait a second here, because I know if you're typing or whatnot, it can take a minute. Maybe we don't have any others.
No, maybe not.
Again, we're all ready to get to the weekend, I think. So,
Wait, there might be one.
oh, there might be one coming.
Yes, there is.
Oh, right.
Okay. So how do you determine work experience services or workplace readiness training?
Oh, I'm glad somebody asked that, because I meant to say something about that. That is an excellent question, and I've had that asked before too. So when Michelle was talking, she was talking about the job placement process and items like helping them with interviewing and their resume and things like that. And those you will also see under the category of workplace readiness training. And the delineation is this. If you are providing that job placement service, it's all in the context of helping that student find a job. And so the goal of all the services you're providing is to find a job. But if you are helping a student just in general to gain those skills, it's kind of outside of a job search process. So you're maybe in a class and you're talking to students about how to fill out an application, or you're telling them how do you do a resume, or you're all practicing interviewing. It's outside of that job search process that you are providing that student. So that is the difference, and I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense to everyone in this room? Okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
This is Kim. As you're typing, hopefully, one question that has come up is if you provide pre-ET services or didn't apply to get those on your contract this summer, we will have the way to get it on your contract if you're interested in providing those services is we will have an open amendment period in the future where we will invite you to amend your contract to add these services. And so look for that in the future. We hope that if you're not already providing them, that you will consider doing it.
And we had a couple more come in. One is, can we print this PowerPoint?
Yes. So we did send out a link to the slides, and if you did not get that link, just email one of us and we'll send it to you.
We will also be posting this to our external website where you'll be able to access it easily, and we'll be posting a recording of the webinar as well. So if you want to refer back to it or you have staff who you want to view it and view the PowerPoint, then you'll be able to do that.
All right, and the other question is, how many hours does the work experience need to be? Is the goal 120 hours, or can it be longer term? If longer, when do we close?
Okay, so again, that's a good benchmark. It's a good best practice. So if you're not sure, I would say 120 hours is a good length for a short-term work experience. And going beyond that would be, hey, it'd be a team decision. That student may be working on a certain skill and they just need a little more time for that, or maybe the employer was hoping they would stay for 2 more weeks, or there could be reasons. But for the most part, I'd say stick with 120 hours unless there's a really good valid reason to go beyond that. And that's a team decision, so it's hard right now to say anything more than that. We might learn more throughout this year a little bit more information for all of you on why, we have authorized to go longer than that. So we might have more insight for you as we go.
We have another one from Stephanie. Do you have a list of schools that already provide pre-eds, and how can we access that list?
Oh, gosh.
That'd be nice.
Well, technically, all schools really do provide pre-eds in some way. And, that would be my dream. I think, half my job would be taken care of if there was such a list. We had that link in here of our directories of all the schools across the state. Keep in mind that there's over 570 school districts and charter schools across the state. That's a huge number, and that's not even all the numbers of schools within those districts. So there's a lot. So it's really hard to know what is and isn't available, and sometimes when something is available in a school, it's not necessarily available to every student. So I use a work experience programs or work-based learning programs where the school has a work coordinator. So that may only be available to certain populations of students, or maybe like a student with a disability doesn't have room in their schedule to be able to access it. So it gets really challenging to say exactly where pre-eds are, and so those are ongoing discussions. Good question, though.
Yeah, and I think our staff are going in trying to have those conversations with schools this year.
Mm-hmm.
And as our educators are getting more well-versed on what pre-eds actually are, I think there'll be more fruitful conversations on what they can identify together, too.
Yeah, and maybe, you never know. As this rolls forward, we might someday see such a list. That would be awesome.
That would be awesome. All right. Oh, another one. After a placement plan is signed, do I understand that we have 20 hours total? If we have spent that 20 hours in our mid-placement, what happens?
Okay, so if you recall, there were 4 items that are included in work experience services, and so yes, that first meeting, is a part of that 20 hours, and then helping the student find the job, orient to that or job or work experience, and then the follow-up. If, as you're going along, it's clear that the student is going to need more hours than that, you need to just be communicating that with the VRS staff person, so either the counselor or the pre-eds representative, and they would go to their manager or RAM and get approval for more hours. So it just needs to be approved by the manager of that team, because we want to stay within those hours as much as possible. Did I answer it?
Yeah, this is Kim. I just wanted to bring up that slide again. That was
There
on
it is.
slide 48. So again, it's all these 4 services in that 20 hours, not just the first meeting is part of that.
Anything else?
Questions,
I
everybody? I'm
love
glad that
questions.
you're kind of digesting it all and applying it and kind of thinking more about how it meets your services. So I think so far. I don't have any others.
Okay. Well, I know the last slide, which Kim is getting to here, has contact information. So we have Kim as our Director of Community Partnerships. We have Ann, who's our specialist in contracts here, and then myself, who can answer more of the specific pre-eds related items. Feel free to contact any of us. I don't know what happened to Michelle's contact info. It was on here. We've had different versions of this PowerPoint, so I apologize. But Michelle also is a resource. You could always email me, and I can get questions to Michelle as well as our placement specialist. But thank you, all of you, for attending today on a Friday afternoon and for partnering with us on this endeavor. We're really excited about all of this and what lies ahead in the next year. So with that, have a good weekend.